Albert Camus and Franz Kafka are often grouped together as writers of the absurd, but they imagined the human condition in radically different ways. Kafka's world is shaped like a court. Camus' is shaped like a desert. One is ruled by invisible judgment, the other by indifferent silence. Both are terrifying, but only one allows freedom. In Kafka's novels, especially The Trial, human beings are never simply allowed to exist. Joseph K. is arrested without explanation, yet from that moment on, he assumes he must be guilty. He searches for a crime that would justify the accusation. The system does not need to prove anything. Its power lies in making people doubt themselves. Kafka believed this reflected modern life. Institutions judge us constantly. Schools, governments, employers, religions. Even when they do not explain their verdicts, their authority feels absolute. Over time, people internalize this pressure. They begin to feel defective, inadequate, or morally suspect without knowing why. Guilt becomes a condition of being alive. Camus rejected this entire framework. For Camus, the universe is not a court. It does not accuse. It does not justify. It does not condemn. It simply exists. Human beings are not born guilty. They are born vulnerable, thrown into a world that offers no answers and no excuses. Kafka's characters feel watched. Camus' characters feel abandoned. Kafka's absurd is claustrophobic. Camus' absurd is exposed. This difference matters. In Kafka, you are trapped inside judgment. In Camus, you are exposed to indifference. But indifference, for Camus, is not condemnation. If nothing is judging you, then nothing is secretly damning you either. Kafka's tragedy is that his characters never realize this. They believe in the court even when it destroys them. Camus' revolt begins when you stop believing. To see that the world does not care is frightening. But it is also liberating. You did not fail some cosmic test. You were not born under accusation. You are simply alive in a difficult universe. The court disappears. Only the desert remains. And in that open space, Camus believed, human dignity becomes possible. Kafka's most haunting insight is that guilt does not require wrongdoing. Joseph K. is never told what he has done. Yet he never doubts that he is at fault. The charge itself is enough. He begins searching for a hidden sin that would explain why the system has turned against him. Kafka believed this was how power really works. When rules are opaque and authority is absolute, people assume that any punishment must be deserved. Even when laws are unjust, they feel sacred. Guilt becomes a psychological reflex. Camus saw this as a moral disaster. For Camus, guilt must be tied to action. You can be guilty of hurting someone. You can be guilty of betrayal, cruelty, or neglect. But you cannot be guilty simply for existing. To treat existence as a crime is to destroy human dignity. Kafka's world makes everyone guilty. Camus' world makes guilt precise. This precision is what makes ethics possible. When guilt is infinite, no one knows what they are responsible for. People become trapped in anxiety and self-blame. When guilt is limited to what you actually do to others, responsibility becomes real. Kafka's guilt produces obedience. Camus' freedom produces accountability. This is why Camus believed Kafka's vision, while brilliant, was incomplete. It shows how systems dehumanize, but not how people can resist that dehumanization. Kafka's characters keep trying to justify themselves to a machine that does not care. Camus wanted people to stop doing that. The moment you realize that the universe is not accusing you, shame loses its grip. You no longer have to prove your worth to an indifferent world. You are free to direct your attention outward, toward the people who are suffering around you. Kafka's characters turn inward in fear. Camus' characters turn outward in responsibility. That shift from guilt to solidarity is the beginning of revolt. Kafka's most terrifying invention was not a tyrant, but a system. In The Trial and the Castle, power has no face. It speaks through documents, offices, procedures, and endless delays. No one can explain who is in charge, but everyone feels controlled. The machine operates without mercy and without clarity. Kafka believed this was the true nature of modern authority. Power no longer announces itself. It hides behind rules. People are crushed not by cruelty, but by process. Camus recognized this world immediately, but he refused to give it metaphysical weight. For Kafka, bureaucracy becomes almost divine. It is mysterious, omnipresent, and impossible to escape. For Camus, bureaucracy is simply human failure disguised as order. It is not sacred, it is absurd. Kafka's characters believe the system must be right. Camus' characters learn that the system is arbitrary. This difference determines whether people submit or resist. When power is treated as sacred, disobedience feels sinful. When power is seen as human and flawed, disobedience becomes possible. Camus believed that the greatest danger of modern life was not oppression itself, but the way people internalize it. They begin to think their suffering must be deserved. They apologize to systems that do not care. They search for faults in themselves instead of questioning the structures that harm them. Kafka showed how this happens. Camus wanted to stop it. To revolt, in Camus' sense, is not to overthrow every institution. It is to refuse to let any institution define your worth. You can follow rules without believing in them. You can obey without surrendering your dignity. Kafka's characters obey because they feel guilty. Camus' characters obey only when necessary. That difference is the seed of freedom. In Kafka's world, death feels like a verdict. Joseph K. is executed like a dog, and even at the end there is a sense that his fate has been sealed by some higher law. He dies not just as a man, but as someone who has been condemned. Camus refused to give death this meaning. For Camus, death is not a judgment. It is an event. It does not prove guilt. It does not deliver justice. It simply ends a life. To turn death into moral punishment is to surrender to cruelty. Kafka's universe makes death terrifying because it feels deserved. Camus' universe makes death tragic because it is undeserved. This difference changes how people live. If you believe death is a sentence, you live in fear. You try to appease invisible judges. You seek moral purity. If you believe death is simply the end, then every moment becomes urgent. Every injustice becomes absolute. Camus believed that when there is no final court, human responsibility becomes heavier. No one will correct the balance later. No heaven will undo what is done here. That is why cruelty becomes intolerable. Kafka's characters hope for acquittal. Camus' characters act as if there will be none. This is not pessimism. It is moral seriousness. When nothing will fix the damage later, you must care about it now. Kafka's world waits for judgment. Camus' world demands action. That is why Camus could admire Kafka's vision while rejecting its conclusion. Kafka showed how power makes people feel condemned. Camus wanted to show how people can refuse to live as if they are. Kafka's absurd feels like a trap. His characters are caught inside systems they cannot understand and cannot escape. The more they try to find meaning, the more lost they become. The absurd in Kafka is a nightmare with no awakening. Camus saw the absurd differently. For Camus, the absurd is not a cage. It is a confrontation. It appears when the human need for meaning collides with the silence of the world. But this silence does not condemn us. It simply leaves us without answers. Kafka's absurd crushes. Camus's absurd clarifies. Kafka's characters believe there must be a hidden law. Camus's characters realize there is none. And this realization changes everything. If there is no secret rule you have broken, then you do not need to beg for forgiveness. You are free to live honestly in a world that does not explain itself. Kafka's figures are trapped in anxiety. Camus' figures are freed by lucidity. This does not mean Camus' world is easy. It is harsh, limited, and finite. But it is not morally suffocating. No invisible judge is watching. No cosmic scorecard is being kept. Kafka's nightmare is being judged without knowing why. Camus' nightmare is that no one is watching at all. And Camus chooses the second nightmare because only there does freedom exist. Kafka's characters almost never rebel. They plead, they comply, they adapt. Joseph K. spends his life trying to navigate a system that will never hear him. He does not reject the court. He keeps trying to belong to it. Camus believed this was the deepest tragedy. The machine wins not because it is powerful, but because people accept its authority. They believe its judgments. They internalize its shame. They try to justify themselves to something that does not care. Camus' characters do something Kafka's do not. They say no. Revolt for Camus is not violence. It is refusal. It is the decision not to let any system define your worth. You do not have to overthrow the machine to deny it your soul. Kafka's world says, you are guilty. Camus's world answers, show me. That simple refusal changes everything. When you stop apologizing for existing, power loses its grip. The absurd does not disappear, but it becomes something you face, not something you kneel before. Kafka shows what happens when people accept judgment. Camus shows what happens when they refuse it. Kafka's universe is full of hope, but it is a poisonous hope. His characters always believe that if they try harder, obey better, or find the right official, they might be spared. This hope keeps them trapped. It turns obedience into a kind of faith. Camus rejected this kind of hope. For Camus, hope in an unjust system is submission. When you believe the machine will eventually be fair, you stop resisting it. You wait. And while you wait, people continue to suffer. Kafka's hope keeps people compliant. Camus' refusal makes them free. Camus did not believe in despair either. Despair paralyzes. It convinces you that nothing matters. Revolt, by contrast, gives life its intensity. Even if you lose, you have not surrendered. Kafka's characters are suspended between hope and fear. Camus' characters stand in defiance. This is the ethical difference between their visions of the absurd. One teaches resignation, the other teaches dignity. One of Kafka's most unsettling ideas is that everyone feels responsible, but no one knows for what. Joseph K. is haunted by the sense that he has failed some invisible law. This creates paralysis. When guilt is everywhere, action becomes impossible. You are always too ashamed to act. Camus believed this was one of the great dangers of modern life. When people are made to feel guilty without knowing why, they become easy to control. They hesitate, they apologize, they accept humiliation because they believe they deserve it. Power does not need to use force when shame does the work. Camus wanted to sever guilt from existence. For him, responsibility is not cosmic. It is practical. You are responsible when you harm someone. You are responsible when you abandon someone. You are responsible when you look away from suffering, but you are not responsible simply for being alive in a broken world. Kafka's universe says, you are guilty, therefore you must obey. Camus' universe says, you are free, therefore you must care. This shift changes everything. When guilt disappears, responsibility becomes something you choose rather than something imposed. You act not because you are afraid of judgment, but because someone is suffering in front of you. Kafka traps his characters in moral fog. Camus gives his characters a compass. That compass does not point toward salvation. It points toward other people. Kafka's world is obsessed with justice, but it is a justice that never appears. The law exists everywhere, yet no one can see it clearly. Trials occur, verdicts are implied, punishments are delivered, but the rules are never explained. Justice becomes a haunting presence rather than a protection. Camus rejected this vision completely. For Camus, justice is not mysterious or cosmic. It is human. It is what happens when one person refuses to let another be crushed. It is imperfect, limited, and fragile, but it is real. Kafka's justice is infinite and unreachable. Camus' justice is finite and practical. In Kafka, you are judged by a system. In Camus, you are judged by how you treat others. This is why Camus believed Kafka's world was dangerous. It trains people to accept judgment without explanation. It teaches them to obey invisible rules. Camus wanted people to demand reasons and to refuse any authority that could not give them. Kafka's characters submit to the law. Camus' characters challenge it. One produces fear, the other produces responsibility. When justice becomes abstract, cruelty becomes easy. When justice becomes human, cruelty becomes visible. Camus believed that the only justice worth having is the kind that can be argued, defended, and criticized by those it affects. Kafka's law cannot be questioned. Camus' justice must be. That difference marks the boundary between domination and dignity. Kafka's world is filled with silence, not the peaceful silence of reflection, but the oppressive silence of unanswered questions. His characters ask why they are accused, why they are punished, why the system exists, and they never receive an answer. That silence becomes part of the cruelty. It makes them doubt their own worth. Camus also believed the universe was silent, but he did not believe silence had to destroy us. For Camus, the silence of the world is not a judgment. It is simply a fact. The universe does not explain itself. It does not justify suffering. But this does not mean human voices must be silent as well. Kafka's characters speak into a void. Camus's characters speak to one another. When the universe offers no meaning, people can still create presence. They can still comfort the sick, protest injustice, and refuse humiliation. The silence of the cosmos does not cancel the sound of human solidarity. Kafka shows what happens when silence becomes shame. Camus shows what happens when silence becomes clarity. One isolates, the other connects. This is why Camus believed that even in an absurd world, human dialogue matters. When nothing answers you from above, the voice beside you becomes everything. Kafka's characters live as though meaning exists somewhere beyond them, hidden in files, offices, or laws they can never access. They believe that if only they could understand the system, their lives would finally make sense. This belief keeps them obedient. Camus rejected that kind of meaning. For Camus, meaning does not descend from above. It is created between people. When you refuse humiliation, when you stand beside someone who is suffering, when you act without waiting for cosmic approval, that is where meaning appears. Kafka's meaning is vertical. Camus' meaning is horizontal. Kafka's world tells you that you must earn your right to exist. Camus' world tells you that existence comes first, and dignity follows from how you live within it. This is why Camus believed Kafka's vision, though powerful, was incomplete. Kafka showed how guilt and power deform people. Camus wanted to show how people could resist that deformation. The absurd does not have to be a prison. It can be a clearing. When nothing judges you, you are free to choose what matters. Franz Kafka and Albert Camus both described a world that feels hostile, opaque, and deeply unfair. But what they believed that world meant could not be more different. Kafka believed we live under an invisible judgment. Camus believed we live under an indifferent sky. Kafka's characters are guilty without knowing why. Camus' characters are free because there is no one to accuse them. Kafka teaches us how power makes us feel ashamed. Camus teaches us how to refuse that shame. One shows the nightmare of obedience. The other shows the dignity of revolt. Kafka's world is a courtroom without an exit. Camus' world is a desert, harsh but open. And in that open space, Camus believed, human beings can still choose something simple and radical, to stand, to care, and to refuse to kneel before a world that does not deserve their submission. That is the difference between being condemned by the absurd and living inside it.